This is the second part of the sheep nutrition, and this will be starting with the when the lamb is born and talking about the different ways you can manage the lamb side of sheep nutrition. The very first thing when a newborn lamb nutritionally, or a lamb is just born, nutritionally it needs the colostrum. That's the first milk produced by the female, very rich in antibodies and helps boost that lamb's immunity, but it's also rich in proteins and fats and other nutrients that are going to help get that lamb going and get him up and going, and so that he's viable and strong and increases lamb's survivability. The challenge is, though, that usually there's about a 24-hour window that the lamb's able to absorb the antibodies and the nutrients and stuff coming from that colostrum. So it's imperative that it receives it within 24 hours and as early as possible. The general rule of thumb is that lambs need about 1 ounce of colostrum per pound of body weight during their first 24 hours of life. At the sheep and goat unit at Chico State, our lambs will average probably about 10 to 12 pounds at birth. They are black-faced sheep, and they're going to be a little bit heavier. We do have some that get down into the 7 to 8 pound range. So they need several ounces, depending on their body weight, of colostrum. The best colostrum source is from that lamb's mother that has been managed nutritionally, and her health has been managed so that she has the richest colostrum possible. If we have a situation that the ewe is not producing any colostrum or something happens, you can use fresh colostrum. That's your second best choice from another ewe that's already lamb. Older ewes have better colostrum than younger ewes, but at this stage you take anything that you have that's fresh. If you don't have any other fresh colostrum, a lot of sheep producers keep frozen colostrum on hand. And the thing is, if you have frozen colostrum, you may want to make sure you thaw it slowly. And so you don't want to just microwave it, because that kills and denatures the antibodies. So you want to bring it to thaw it slowly, and then you can warm it up to get it into the newborn lamb. Generally, then you can use any other kind of fresh or frozen goat or ewe colostrum from another farm, but make sure that it's of a similar nutritional status to your own flock. There are certain diseases, especially on the goat side, that could be a bigger risk. But Johne's is a disease that can affect sheep. The ovine persistent pneumonia, OPP, and E. coli are all potential risks that if you use it from another farm. So make sure they have a similar health status to you. Cow colostrum is another good source if you have any dairies in the area that you could get some colostrum. You've got to give a third more volume than you normally would, so 1 1/3 ounces per pound of body weight. There is a risk with the Johne, so you want to make sure you're getting it from a healthy herd of some kind. They do make synthetic colostrum. It's good, it's reasonable in a pinch, but it is definitely one of your last resorts if you can't find colostrum from any other source. Finally, the last thing you can do is milk replacer, but it is not a substitute for colostrum. You need to get some form of colostrum into that lamb from one of the other sources immediately following birth. Occasionally with sheep you will have bottle babies or orphan lambs, especially if you have triplets and twins and stuff like that. And so you want to make sure they get adequate colostrum. Then you're going to try to find a lamb milk replacer. Sheep's milk has different nutrients than cow's milk does. And so those lambs actually have a little bit different nutrient requirements than the calves do. Make sure you follow the directions to mix it properly. And after the first few days, you want to actually feed cold milk to help prevent the lambs from overeating, especially if you have it on a larger supply that they can do that. If you have small numbers, like 1 or 2 babies, you could just use a bottle. But if you have larger numbers, a friend of mine that has about 400 ewes, they do sometimes get larger numbers of orphans that they have somebody that takes them, and they set up a lamb bar, kind of like the picture. This is actually of some goats, but they're nursing at a lamb bar that you can set up to have multiple nipples so that the animals can nurse and drink, and you can have anywhere from 6 to 8 kind of animals nursing on that milk, and it makes it easier for you as a producer to manage. You want to get bottle babies on feed early, and so that you can wean them early. And generally you want to make sure they're at least 20 pounds before you wean them. When we start talking about these young lambs, the first part of their life, they're going to be getting most of their milk from their mother, most of their nourishment and nutrients from their mother's milk. lambs are going to start nibbling on solid feed very soon after birth. Within a few days, they're nibbling, they're curious, they're starting to check things out in their environment. And most of that used milk is going to be supplied in the first 8 weeks of lactation, about 75%. And then it peaks between 3 to 5 weeks and then steadily declines. The general rule of thumb is when we start to think about weaning lambs is that they're 60 days or 60 pounds. So that would be about 2 months of age, which coincides with the ewes declining milk production. Sometimes in commercial operations they run a little bit longer, like 90 days. But by the time the lambs are 4 to 6 weeks old, they're probably getting 50% of their nutrients from other sources besides their mother's milk. So their reliability on their mother is declining as well. We do in the sheep industry creep feed quite a bit, and it's a means of providing some extra nutrients, usually a grain of some kind to nursing lambs. They gain better, they adapt to the weaning process a little bit better, and you just set it up as a creep system such that the lambs can get in, but the mothers can't. For example, with our show lambs that we sell as project lambs, the fall-born lambs we definitely creep feed because we are trying to get them to where we can wean them at the 60-day mark and get them prepped for sales so that we can sell them to 4-H and FFA members started, healthy, and in good shape so they can go to May fairs. Creep feeding is very useful if your flocks have lots of multiple births, like if you run to the twins and triplets, or if milk production is limited for whatever manner. It is more efficient to feed the lamb directly than to feed the ewe to produce more milk to feed the lamb, which makes sense. So that's why creep feeding has some value. If you're developing your lambs on pasture, you may or may not want to creep feed. We sometimes do not creep, depending on how much pasture we have. In the spring, we may or may not creep feed our lambs. You've got to evaluate the cost effectiveness of it for the situation, because this may be something that doesn't pencil out for your production goals or your situation. So it's something to consider. Here's some pictures that show some examples of creep areas where the lambs can gain access to the grain area, but the ewes cannot. And so it should be located in a high traffic area. Light actually helps to attract lambs, but sometimes that's not feasible. Should be kept dry, well bedded, and kind of a safe area for the lambs. They also like to sometimes sleep in there. They kind of escape their moms in there. You generally want about 2 square feet per lamb that you have. We set up our creep feeder in the pasture setting a lot. That's where we tend to have ours set up, especially if we do spring creep feeding. In the fall, we sometimes set it up inside, but the majority of the time it'll be set up on pasture. Once lambs are about 1 week of age, we start putting out the creep feed. And generally, really tasty feeds, highly palatable feeds that have a small particle size, like soybean meal, cracked corn, those kinds of things work really well as a lamb creep. Should be about 18 to 20% protein, usually coming from like a soybean meal type source. It can include a coccidiostat, and it should, like decox, and that's where we use a standard 18% protein grain mix that includes that coccidiostat. Depending on your production goals, you can include an antibiotic or not. Keep the feed fresh and dry. Don't ever let the feed run out. They should have free choice access to it. Make sure they have good, clean, fresh water. And you can even provide a decent hay if they're not on a pasture setting. And you want to make sure your feeders are ones that the lambs can't stand up or play in, because then they defecate in it, they track mud in it, and it wastes feed. There's a couple different ways you can creep feed. We sometimes set up a grain bin or a creep feeder that we use a grain out on our pasture, but again, that totally depends on our quantity and quality of grazing. Sometimes you can even set up a creep gate that lets lambs into a higher quality pasture than they use, and they do really well with that. If you have a certain area that's rich in clover and good quality grasses, let the lambs graze into there as a creep area as opposed to feeding grain. When we talk about weaning, that's the process of removing the milk diet from the lambs, and it varies depending on your production goals. Some people can do it as early as 30 days. We at the sheep and goat unit use 60 to 90 days. Our show animals we tend to do at 60 days. Our commercially ran sheep we do at about 90 days. And it does cause some stress to the lambs nutritionally and to the ewe, and so you need to manage both the lambs and the ewes and prep them for the weaning process. For the lamb, hopefully you've got them on creep feed so they know what grain is, they know how to eat out of a bunk. It's kind of like when we talked about backgrounding beef cattle. You're going to put the lamb in familiar surroundings. You're going to leave them within a same group. So if they've been running as a mob and they've got some contemporary group that they're running with, wean them all at once. Don't just wean one or two at a time. Give them a small group. It's kind of like a support system. Keep them on the same diet. That's why we use our 18% protein grain, so we can transition them smoothly over to the weaning diet. They do really well that way. We will vaccinate for what's called enterotoxemia, which is an overeating or pulpy kidney disease, prior to weaning. And at weaning, we give the booster, and then we follow up with even a third booster just to make sure that as much immunity is built up in these lambs for overeating as possible. You sometimes can treat for coccidiosis. We don't treat for it at the sheep and goat unit, but we do feed a coccidiostat in our grain mix to help control coccidiosis. Some people believe in fence line weaning, where they actually maintain a fence line between the lambs and the ewes. We don't necessarily do that at the sheep and goat unit, but it depends on your philosophy and what you want to do and how you can manage it. For the ewe, we are actually going to decrease her grain and decrease her diet to some extent prior to weaning to slow down milk production, and you're actually going to maintain that after weaning. We will actually pull the ewes off of water and feed during the weaning process. They will get 24 hours of no water to slow down milk production and 48 hours of no feed to help slow that milk production down, and it reduces our instances of mastitis in those females. Some people can wean just cold turkey, just pull them off and stop it. If you wean at the later dates, like the 90 to 120 days, those lambs are going to be weaned naturally, and that actually causes the least amount of stress on the ewes and the lambs, because they're already receiving the bulk of their diet from another outside source other than their mother's milk, so minimal stress. Don't forget this week that there is a couple other readings and videos to watch. Make sure that you read on the lamb feedlot side of it. While the feedlot industry is a small segment of the sheep industry, there is certain areas in the western U.S. Dixon, California is one that has a couple lamb feedlots, and outside in Colorado there's a lot of lamb feedlots. And so it's a facet of our industry that's present, and I do want you to be aware of it. So make sure you watch the American sheep industry videos about the 2 California operations and the Colorado lamb feedlot, and read the article on the lamb feedlot.